Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to do an updated review of the TrimUI Smart Pro. Now this is a handheld that I reviewed late last year when it first launched. And at the time I had both good and bad things to say about it. I thought that the controls were pretty good and I really liked the screen, but I also felt like the software was completely unfinished, and I also wasn't a huge fan of its $90 price point. Well, a lot of things have changed since then, including the fact that we have a lot of other software options available, and probably most importantly, you can find this easily on AliExpress for around $55 most of the time. And I think it's worth taking another look at this device just based on all the different updates that we've seen on it, but then also through the lens of the fact that it is now truly a budget handheld. And over the months I've seen it grow to be a lot of people's favorites, including my own when it comes to playing Game Boy Advance games. And there are a couple other ways where this device really shines, including playing widescreen versions of certain games, as well as PC ports, which often will be in 16:9. And to top it off, I think this might be one of the best low-cost streaming handhelds that you can find right now. And so in this video, we're going to take all those factors and more and put it all together to decide whether or not this device warrants its $50 price point. And spoiler alert, I think it does. It's probably one of the best value handhelds you can find right now, provided you're okay with working around some of its little quirks. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, since it's been a minute since my last review, let's go over some of the most important details. The CPU is an all-winner A133+. That's a quad-core chip and about on par with the XX devices from Anbernic, as well as the Rockchip 3566. So what that means, like with the others, is that you'll be able to play up through PS1 with no issue, and then it'll get a little bit wonky once you get to Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, and PlayStation Portable. We've also got a gig of RAM and 8 GB of internal storage. And that internal storage will host the firmware, and you'll put everything else on a microSD. Now the display here is definitely punching above its weight class, especially at this $55 price point. It's about 5 inches and a 720p resolution. We've also got a pretty big battery, 5000 mAh, which has given me between 4 and 6 hours of mixed gameplay. Now in terms of connectivity, this does have Wi-Fi, but it's 2.4 GHz, and it also has Bluetooth, but I'm not sure which version it's using. And depending on the custom software that you use, there is the ability to use it either with Bluetooth controllers or even Bluetooth audio. And one last feature worth comparing against other devices at a similar price point, the TrimUI Smart Pro does not have video out. So if you are looking for something that you can plug into an external monitor or TV, I would recommend the Anbernic XX line instead. Speaking of which, let's move over to some size comparisons to get an idea of how big the TrimUI Smart Pro is. And we'll start with one of those XX devices I was mentioning just a second ago. So this is the RG35XXH. This one has a 4:3 aspect ratio screen, but it's only 3.5 inches, so it's a little on the small side. Anbernic just recently released a 4-inch version, which is very similar to the TrimUI Smart Pro. For example, this one also has stacked shoulder buttons and RGB lights around its analog sticks. Another device in this price range that has probably been one of the biggest sellers of the year is this one, the RG35XX-SP. And by virtue of being a clamshell, even though when it's opened up it's about the same size as a TrimUI Smart Pro, it can get really compact, which is pretty awesome. I would say among all the emulation handhelds that are on the market right now, it's probably the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus and beyond line that actually are the closest in size to the TrimUI Smart Pro. And to give you an idea of scale, that means they're going to be a little bit smaller than a Nintendo Switch Lite and quite a bit smaller than something like the Steam Deck. And this is where the TrimUI Smart Pro really starts to shine, in the sense that it can be a complementary handheld to something bigger. I often think of the PS Vita along those same lines, and these two are just about the same size as well. Now real quickly, let's go over some of the things I like and don't like about the controls on the TrimUI Smart Pro. And we'll start with the D-pad, which I think overall is mostly good. This has a soft dome switch connection, which means that when you press on it, you will feel a little bit of a click, but it'll be very soft and muted. If anything, I would say it's a little bit on the firm side, but not too bad. I would say it's not fatiguing, but it does take a little bit of effort to push down on the button. Now there is some pivot to this D-pad, but it is not great. In fact, as I showed in my original review, this kind of fails the contra test. And that's because when you wiggle it back and forth, it's kind of hard to actually make the character move. Ideally, the character will move a little bit when you go to the very edges, and that's about it. However, with this D-pad, you have to push pretty darn hard to get it to move at all. This says one of two things. Number one is that it's going to be very hard to have an accidental diagonal, but also it's going to take some effort to actually hit the diagonal as well. And a better test to see how easy it is to press a diagonal would be a Street Fighter test. And here with Street Fighter 3, you can see that most of the time I am able to hit those moves, but there are definitely some times when I'm not. And I think this boils down to the fact that diagonal diagonals on this device are not quite as easy as I would like them to be. In the end, I would say it's very close and almost there, but just not quite perfect for me. So again, I would classify this D-pad as being mostly good, and I like the fact that it's nice and quiet. Now moving over to the face buttons, it's a very similar experience as the D-pad, but without any reservations. These are excellent face buttons. They do take some force to press down on. I would say they're a tiny bit stiffer than on a Nintendo Switch Joy-Con, but otherwise, yeah, I think these are really nice and precise. Moving over to the shoulders and triggers, these also have a clickiness to them, but it almost feels micro-switchy with some padding. Of note, I do think that the trigger buttons are a little bit on the mushy side, but altogether, I think it's just fine for a cheaper handheld. The only thing that really bothers me about these controls are the analog sticks, and these are PS Vita-like. They're not actually from a PS Vita, but they're a generic third-party version. The first thing I don't like about them is they don't click down L3 and R3, which can inhibit some controls depending on the emulator or if you're streaming or something like that. In addition, these analog sticks are very recessed into the shell, which makes them nice and pocketable because they don't stick out that much, but it does feel like you don't have a lot of range of motion when you're using it, and it almost feels a little bit flicky. And so it doesn't give you that nice, fluid, analog kind of feeling that you get on the hardware side. Now on the software side, I have found it a little bit odd. I've tried two different TrimUI Smart Pros, both from different batches, and I found the same thing happens to me when I'm playing an analog-centric game. And that is that at certain times, and I'm not sure why, just certain controls will not work to a full extent. So sometimes I can't press up all the way, but often it's that I can't press left. And I found it's exacerbated more when I'm pressing a button at the same time, and somehow the analog stick input just doesn't work. To me, it feels like a kernel level problem and not something to do with the hardware itself, given the fact that I've tried two different devices and two different sticks on each device. And so it's really hard to pinpoint with this other than to state that yes, when I'm trying analog stick-centric games, I found myself not enjoying it as much as I wish I could. Part of that just has to do with the fact that we're using very small sticks that are also inset into the case, but it does feel, especially within RetroArch, that I'm missing inputs and I'm not sure why. Now, putting it all together, I don't have a lot of complaints about the controls, especially at this price point. And so yes, I wish the analog sticks were better, but it's a really comfortable device, all things considered. And I think if you plan on using this mostly for D-pad-centric gaming, it's going to be a great experience. Okay, moving on, let's talk a little bit more about the screen, because I do want to emphasize just how nice it is altogether. And I think there are two things that really make it stand apart. The first is that it is a nice and high-quality screen in terms of just the overall richness of the color. And the other thing I like about it is that it has a 720p resolution, which means we've got 720 vertical pixels to work with, which gives us a lot of room when it comes to scaling. Let's use Super Nintendo as an example. Because we have such a high resolution, that means that we can toggle on or off integer scale. And thanks to the high resolution screen, that means that even with integer scaling on, the black borders at the top and bottom are not that wide. And I love having a choice like this, where you can have these perfectly scaled pixels but not have a lot of border at the top and bottom, or you can turn off integer scale and blow it up as big as you would like, and still not have that many unbalanced pixels. For example, here with Mega Man's life bar, I'm using this with non-integer scaling and no shader, and you can see that the life bar is very close to being balanced. And for me personally, at a 5-inch screen like this, I think it's good enough, and so I often will just play it with integer scale turned off so I can get as big of an image as possible. Another system I love to play with this screen is Game Boy Advance because again, with non-integer scaling, it fills up a lot of the screen and it still looks nice and balanced. And if you throw an LCD grid shader on top of it, it looks even better. And so I really like this experience right here. Now, one thing I don't like about the screen is how smudgy it can get. And that's just by virtue, I think, of the materials and the fact that your fingerprints will stick pretty fairly often. So I did find myself having to buff them out often, and it would take a while to actually get them to go away. I found the easiest fix for that was to get a screen protector because it's a different type of glass and this one's a little bit more smudge resistant. And thankfully they got a 3-pack on Amazon for $10. I'll leave it linked down below, but I put that on both of my TrimUI Smart Pros, and so that's what you'll see throughout the video. Okay, moving on, let's talk about some other elements, both good and bad. Let's talk about one I don't like, which is the audio quality, and that's because the speakers, as you can see right here, these black squares, they're at the back of the machine. Not only that, the output of the speaker isn't even pointing towards the direction of where the speaker holes are. Instead, it's actually pointing towards the battery. What this means is that when we're playing a game, even though we have quote-unquote front-facing speakers, all the audio is actually getting pushed to the back. What this means is as you're playing, it's going to sound really muffled, and then for anybody else in the room, it's going to sound a lot louder to them. Another thing I'm not a huge fan of with this device is that the right side of it on the back will get quite warm once you push it past PlayStation 1. So when trying to play things like Dreamcast, PSP, and Nintendo 64, it'll get quite warm on the back. And that's because the CPU is right here between the speaker and the battery, and so this heat is just going to be generated directly into the shell. And for me personally, I'm not a fan of ambient heat like this, and so I tend not to play some of these high-end games just by virtue of the fact that they get quite warm after a few minutes. Another thing worth noting is this device is capable of rumble, and you'll find it on certain emulators like Dreamcast, as well as some ports, and then also a few Game Boy Advance games. But bear in mind that the rumble motor is just taped onto the back of the shell, and so when it does rumble, it's just going to rumble directly into your fingers as opposed to making the device rumble. And so I have found this to be a somewhat jarring and unpleasant experience compared to actually putting the rumble motor on the board itself. Again, it's a bit of a minor issue considering the systems that actually support it. Now, the last thing I wanted to bring up that I really like about this device is the fact that its sleep mode works really well. On all the software that we're going to be showing throughout the video, all you have to do is just tap on the power button at any time and it'll go into suspend mode. And this suspend mode works really well. It doesn't have a ton of battery drain. I would say overnight you lose between 3 and 5%. So it's definitely one of those types of devices that you can put into sleep, walk away for several hours and come back and jump right back into your game. And compared to other devices within this price point, that's a pretty rare feat, and so I do enjoy that feature. And so I think that this sleep mode, as well as a rather large battery, work really well together. It turns it into a device that you can just kind of turn on when you're ready to game, and most of the time the battery will still be charged. Okay, next up I want to talk a little bit about software and all the different options that we have, and I do want to show that I did buy a second TrimUI Smart Pro as opposed to the launch one that I had earlier. And this mostly was because I wanted to see if there were any hardware changes between that one and this one, and there really hasn't been any. But then also I wanted to test out the latest firmware that they are shipping with these devices to give you an out-of-box experience. So here we are with the latest TrimUI Smart Pro that I bought off AliExpress for around $50 and the SD card that came with it. And right off the bat, you'll see that the first menu is what they call best, and this is really just what they call a collections menu. And I do like the fact that you can customize this. You can put, all your Pokemon games into one, or maybe all your Mario games and so on. But I do think the majority of your time will be in the emulators menu. That's going to be one tab over to the right. Here you can see all these systems that are supported with the stock firmware, and it's also been preloaded with a bunch of different games. Of note, the games list that is available on this device, especially with the retro game systems, is very comprehensive. Most of the other systems that you will find at this price point will usually have a smattering of games, but they will be poorly organized. Here with this card, I found it's a pretty robust collection, but then also it's got a lot of different franchises that you wouldn't find on others. For example, all the Mario games are on here as opposed to on the Amronic ones where they have been taking them off. Either way, it's super easy to add and remove games onto the SD card as well, and so I think overall it's a pretty plug-and-play experience. Now, to the right of that is the apps section, and there are a couple things here worth noting. The first is the function key setting. This was not available when I did my first review. And here you've got a bunch of different options, and by default, it's going to turn on CPU performance mode. And if you watched my previous video, you may remember that I didn't know what this button did because there was no labeling whatsoever. At the time, I thought it was turning on rumble, but it turns out that no, it was turning on power save in the older version. And to be honest, that did mess up some of my emulation testing in that previous video, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to do an update. Either way, I appreciate the fact that we now have the ability to define what the function key will do. Another important section within the stock firmware is the settings menu. This is where you can turn on things like Wi-Fi and adjust the brightness and so on. Either way, that's a really quick look at the stock firmware. I think it's been pretty well organized in the sense that you can just jump in and out of your games, and it's pretty easy to use. Now, if you have an older TrimUI Smart Pro like me, one of the great things that this company has been doing is releasing new firmware and software images. And in addition to the firmware image, they also have been updating the base SD card image to add new apps and things like that. I'll leave a link to both of these down below. It's very easy to set these up. And so this is my original TrimUI Smart Pro with that original stock firmware that I've now been updating both from the firmware and the SD card image. I've also made a couple other tweaks myself, like changing out the icons for some of these emulators so they are more US friendly. I've also taken it upon myself to add just a few third-party apps to enhance my experience with the stock firmware. And these apps come from a single repository called TrimUI Smart Pro Tools. And we've got quite a few options here depending on what you're trying to do. For example, if you want to FTP into your device, you want to boot a random game, or turn on maximum CPU, there's apps for each of those. So if you do plan on sticking with the stock firmware and you want to get the most out of it, I would recommend these third-party tools because it can enhance that overall experience. I like the Rainbow LEDs tool, which allows you to cycle through all the different colors around your analog sticks. Anyway, that's a quick look at the overall stock experience, which is what I had been using up until about a month ago. The biggest thing I did here was really just taking out all the games that I didn't want and then putting on my own and then adding all the box art, and all that was pretty easy as well. And so I'd say this is one of the strengths of the TrimUI Smart Pro is that out of the box, the experience is not bad and it's pretty easy to enhance it with just a couple tools. And so if you're not ready to jump into new firmware and all the stuff that comes with it, you can just kind of stick with stock and it's not a bad experience. So next I want to talk about a couple options in terms of modified versions of the stock operating system. The first one is called Tomato OS, and this is made by the developer behind things like Retro Arena. A couple highlights of Tomato OS is that it expands the number of systems that you can play to about 100. It also supports some of those apps that we were just talking about, as well as the Vulkan graphical backend. However, as of making this video, Tomato OS has not really had any development happen over the past few months, and so something else has been cropping up lately. And this one is called CrossMix-OS, which is basically an enhanced version of the stock OS experience. And this one's been constantly updated over the past few months, and so I ended up going with this one for my testing just because it's a little bit more recent. I also like the fact that it has some very comprehensive installation and FAQ instructions as well. Now the installation process is very easy. All you have to do is just format an SD card to FAT32 and then just drag and drop all of the files. From there, I spent a little bit of time tweaking the overall experience, and this is what I ended up with. And so this is CrossMix-OS with a little bit of my own tweaks just to make it a little bit more towards my own style. The overall navigation experience is going to be exactly the same, so you will have the same menus, be able to jump in and out of your games. However, under the Apps tab, there have been a ton of different changes. So let's go over these really quickly. To start, they've incorporated all of those third-party apps we were talking about before, as well as some extras. For example, this one has an onboard scraper, so you can add all your box art directly over Wi-Fi. It also supports over-the-air updates as well as a bunch of great tools, including screen recording and PortMaster. And this is definitely one of the highlights of the device. We will be talking about ports here later in this video. For now, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this System Tools app, because this actually has a lot of different things that you can change. For example, under the Emulators folder, we have three main options. The first is that you can decide whether or not to have overlays or bezels as you're playing games. So for example, if you have them on, this is what it'll look like. It'll take the black bars on the left and right, and then cover it with an overlay specific to whatever system that you're playing. And I can see this going either way. I think a lot of people really like to have these bezels, but I think it also looks very good with the black bars on the left and right as well. And so if you do want to toggle between having the system overlays, or if you'd rather have the black bars, this is where you would change it in the settings. In addition, you can choose to have it auto-load your save state, as well as do a quick start if you power it down while playing a game. Let me give you an example. If we're here in Sonic Advance 2, if I press select and start, it's going to exit out of the game and bring me back to the menu. But in that process, it did save a state, and if I start up the game again, now it's going to auto-load where I was. So that's great if you want to just jump in and out of your game from the overall menu. However, let's say that you actually want to power down the device and then come back into the game. You can do that as well. And so I have this enabled in the settings, and so when I power it down and then power it back up, it's going to go back to the game directly and even that save state that I was in. Now the boot up time is not super fast, it's about 23 seconds, and so it does take a little bit of time to actually get into it, but I think it's pretty cool to be able to just jump right into your game. And that's going to make it really easy for people who aren't tech savvy either. Now within a game, you've got a couple other options as well. For example, you can press select and R1, and that's going to turn on fast forward. And that'll be super handy if you're trying to play a Pokemon game or something along those lines. We've also got this select and start hotkey to close out of the game like we mentioned before, but also you can just tap the menu button and bring up the sub menu. And you've got a lot of options here. Here we can manually save and load a state, and then also if we go into the advanced menu, it'll actually go into the RetroArch quick menu. So we do have full access to everything within RetroArch to be able to tailor this to our needs, but the nice thing about it is that a lot of it has been pre-configured already. So I do think the overall user experience is fairly intuitive, and I like that. Now also within this System Tools menu, we can do a lot more things. For example, we can change out the behavior of the LEDs depending on what we want to see, and there's a ton of different network options. You can SSH directly into your device or even set up syncing for cloud saves. Another place I've been spending a lot of time is the themes folder. This allows me to pick just an overall theme pack, or I can go into the advanced settings and change everything out one by one. This allows me to use a background from one theme, but then maybe the icons from a different theme, and so it just ends up looking really cool. And so I do appreciate the amount of customization we have within this menu, and there are a bunch of different community packs as well. Now when it comes to performance, most things have been optimized already for you, but there are a couple things you can do manually. For example, with Nintendo 64, it's always a matter of finding the right emulator for the game, and here we can press the X button while hovering over a game, and we have 6 different options to choose from. And so by default, if you try a Nintendo 64 game and it's not working very well, maybe the graphics are weird, or maybe it's not playing at full speed, I would recommend trying one of the other options. And so among all the systems that you can emulate on here, it's the Nintendo 64 one that I would recommend messing around with just to make sure that every game is going to play like you would like it to. Now this device also has a Moonlight app, which will allow you to do PC streaming. And it's a pretty easy setup process, and I have an old guide that works for it as well. But essentially, once you've connected to the IP address of your computer, you'll be able to access that Steam library. And from there, you'll be able to stream the games directly onto your TrimUI Smart Pro. However, one thing worth noting, the Wi-Fi signal here is only 2.4 gigahertz, and so that is not going to give you as fast of a speed as 5 gigahertz. But I did find that in my own home testing, it worked out pretty well. Maybe I was getting lucky, but I did find Moonlight to be pretty good on this. However, it is worth noting that I didn't really enjoy playing more modern games, those that have dual analog stick gameplay, just because it's a little bit awkward to use these as well as those shoulders and triggers. And this is another area where the lack of L3 and R3 functionality on those sticks does come into play. However, if you just want to play some lightweight games, maybe something that uses either the D-pad or just a single analog stick, I did find this to be a pretty good experience. So I would consider this to be the cheapest device right now that has a proper aspect ratio for streaming most modern games. Okay, that's about it when it comes to CrossMix-OS. There are a couple others available as well as MinUI, but I want to focus on one more firmware before we move on. And this is going to be KNULLI, which is a fork of Batocera, and I've talked about this extensively with other handhelds. And they do have a build specifically for the TrimUI Smart Pro. Now it's still in alpha state, so it's not quite ready for prime time, but they do have public releases on their GitHub page, which I will have linked down below. The main draw of KNULLI is that it's a very beautiful custom firmware. It's using an emulation station front end, and you can add things like screensaver as well as video previews, and so everything just looks really nice and customizable. And so when it comes to just playing some retro games, especially Game Boy Advance, this is a really nice and seamless experience. Of note, when exiting out of a game, it's going to be menu and start with this firmware compared to select and start with the others. Now, before you make KNULLI your primary operating system for the TrimUI Smart Pro, I do want to caution that there are some systems that just aren't booting for me. And it just so happened to be all the high-end systems, so Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and PSP, none of those were working properly. For some systems, the games would boot and I could actually hear them playing, but nothing would show up on the screen. So I would say this is still a very early operating system unless you really just want to focus on the low-end systems. And if so, then yeah, this is going to be a great experience. If anything, I would say if you have a spare SD card, I would recommend trying it out and seeing if it's going to be a good fit for you. This one also does have PortMaster out of the box as well, which is pretty awesome. However, as of making this video and as it stands over the past month or so of testing all these different builds, I'm definitely finding that CrossMix-OS is a better fit for me. The user interface is a little bit on the clunky side, but I do appreciate the fact that the community has stepped up to make it prettier, and so I'm kind of enjoying this whole experience right now, especially considering the fact that we have the ability to do a quick shutdown and auto resume, which is one of my favorites with these cheaper handhelds. Okay, so now that we've talked about the different operating system options, let's actually start moving into gameplay performance to give you an idea of what you can expect from the TrimUI Smart Pro. For the most part, I'm going to be using CrossMix-OS, but I will jump back and forth between stock and KNULLI as well. When it comes to your handheld systems like Game Boy and Game Boy Color, they work absolutely fine. The only thing to really pay attention to is the fact that we do have some pretty wide black bezels on the left and right. And that's just by virtue of the fact that this is a 10:9 system showing on a 16:9 display. When it comes down to it, my favorite system to play on this is easily Game Boy Advance, just because it's a 3:2 aspect ratio, which fills out a lot of the screen. In addition, it's a D-pad centric device with some nice clicky controls, and so I've really enjoyed playing Game Boy Advance games on this system. I've also found that 4x3 systems, NES, Super Nintendo, Genesis, all these run absolutely fine. The black bars are going to be a little bit bigger on the left and right because they're 4x3, but I would say thanks to the high resolution display with those nice rich colors, it is an excellent experience. Arcade games also play pretty well, but there is going to be a cap, much like with other systems with a similar chipset. So you will be able to play up through CPS3 games, no problem, but once you start pushing into things like Killer Instinct, yeah, they're not going to play at full speed. But still, there are going to be thousands of 80s and 90s classics that you can play on this machine with no issue. Moving on, let's talk about PlayStation 1. This is the last system that I play with performance mode turned off, and this one still plays everything at full speed. And so if you are wanting to play through the PS1 catalog, or maybe even try out some widescreen hacks, this will be a great place to start. So now let's move into the systems that do require performance mode to be turned on with that function key down below. And I gotta say, performance here is going to be a mixed bag, much like it is with other devices in the same price range. We'll start with Sega Saturn, which unfortunately I did not find to be playable at all. This one usually plays only at about half speed. So unfortunately, if you are wanting to play Sega Saturn, you're going to have to look elsewhere. Now, Dreamcast performs about what I would expect, and that is that most games will play pretty well. These games are not going to play at full speed. If you look at the top right, you will see it will hover between 30 and 60 frames per second, depending on the game. And that's because there's an auto frame skip enabled with this emulator, so it is going to feel playable, but I would not consider it to be full speed. But I was surprised to find that some games that often struggle with similar devices actually play at full speed, like Rez. But then also paradoxically, some games that usually play just fine, like Marvel vs. Capcom 2, did not actually play at full speed. It would dip below 30 here and there. So I would say conservatively that about 50% of the Dreamcast catalog is going to be playable one way or another, provided you're okay with that frame skip. But just bear in mind that many games are not going to be playable or anywhere close to it. Okay, let's move on to Nintendo 64. I found the performance here to be fairly impressive, but the overall gaming experience to not be very fun. And a lot of this came down to those analog inputs. I found that so often I would be trying to play a game and I would be hampered by my controls. I'm not sure if others are having the same analog stick issue, and so I would be interested to hear a comment down below, whether or not I need to buy a third device to test it once more. But at least from a performance standpoint, I would say that, yeah, about 50% of games are going to play just fine. Others will have a little bit of slowdown, and then others at the top end, like Cruisin' USA or Conker's Bad Fur Day, these ones are not going to play at full speed. So again, Nintendo 64 is going to be hit and miss. One other thing to consider is that because we're also playing these in performance mode, that does mean the device is going to heat up quite a bit. And so in combination of the performance issues, as well as the fact that it's going to get warm, this doesn't seem to be a good fit for me when it comes to these higher end systems. Okay, and so for our last emulated system, we're going to talk about PSP. And this is a game system that I really wish played at full speed on this device, because we have that nice screen that's going to fit it perfectly, but then also we have those controls and the overall shape of the device, which feels very Sony. But unfortunately, I found the PSP experience to be severely lacking. Now, I've heard a lot of people say that PSP runs perfectly on this device, even God of War, and so I definitely had to investigate that. And the first thing I noticed when playing this game on the stock or even the CrossMix-OS settings is that yes, it plays at 100% speed according to the settings, but it is also running at 20 frames per second instead of 60. Now, I'm not an expert in the PSP emulator settings, but I found quite a few things that were turned on by default. One of them is an adjusted system clock speed, and another is that they have a lot of cheats enabled. So if you go in and look at the cheats menu, you can see that some are already turned on. In addition, some games have per game configuration changes, which include things like frame skip. And that's why, on a whole, if you were just to play the stock version of Ridge Racer available on this device, it will feel like it's playing at full speed, but that's because it's taking advantage of a bunch of customizations and hacks in order to get it to work. And as a huge fan of PSP, as soon as I started playing these games, I felt like something was off. It wasn't like the original experience. Now, if I go in and try to turn off all those settings, I did find that some of these games get pretty close to full speed, but not quite there. And this is about the performance that I would expect from this chipset, so no surprises for me. So a game like Ridge Racer is going to have quite severe dips depending on the location, where it's going to drop down to even 50% speed. And so it's really going to be whether or not you're comfortable with adjusting these settings and hacks in order to get these games to run at least as close as you can. A good example with Ridge Racer is to turn on skip buffer effects. This will remove the reflections from the car and also make the screen a little bit weird looking, but it's going to play at full speed and at a 2x resolution, and so this looks pretty great. It really comes down to how much you're willing to live with in terms of getting these games to play at a faster speed while degrading the overall experience. For me personally, I like to have the closest to a native experience as possible, and so for the rest of this testing, I'm not going to make any adjustments. You're just going to see how it works based on the CPU. And when it comes to lightweight games, yeah, as expected, these games are going to play great. There are some like Soul Calibur as well as Virtua Tennis, which will play at a 2x resolution, and I would consider this to be playable. You might get some slowdowns here and there, especially during cutscenes, but I think it's well worth it. Other games like X-Men Legends 2 will play at full speed at a 1x resolution, and I think this is a pretty good experience as well. Tekken 6 is one that doesn't play as well. I would say this is not quite up to speed for me. Especially when it comes to a fighting game, I feel like these should be playing at full speed without any sort of extra hacks. Now, Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories is actually somewhat playable, other than the fact that the analog stick just went totally wonky with this one for me. And so even though from a performance standpoint I found this to be pretty good, on either of my TrimUI Smart Pros I couldn't make this game actually playable because of the analog stick input. So when it comes down to it, whether or not you consider this device to be good at PSP really comes down to how you approach PSP in general. I would say that people who just find it thrilling to be able to play a PSP game on a handheld will probably think this is just fine. But if you're a PSP enthusiast and that you want to have a similar experience to the original PSP but maybe a little bit better with a larger screen, then this might be a little disappointing like it is for me. So when it comes down to it, for Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, and PSP, you're going to have to be choosy about getting lightweight games to play, or if you're going to make some compromises when it comes to emulation hacks. Okay, and so the last thing I wanted to show off are ports via PortMaster. And like I mentioned, with CrossMix-OS as well as KNULLI, PortMaster is working out of the box. However, bear in mind that not every game is supported. In fact, when you go into the PortMaster menu, you're only going to see a truncated list. And even then, I found that many of these games, even when set up properly, were not actually booting and were crashing instead. However, for the games that do run on it, it is an amazing experience, especially for those that natively run at 16:9. In fact, given the amount of games that you can play on this, and the fact that it's only $55, I almost feel like it's worth the investment for this device to use it exclusively as a PortMaster handheld. Just the ability to play some of my favorite lightweight PC games like Axiom Verge and Celeste, and even Sonic Mania and Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge is pretty awesome. And so for me, I think that this is worth the ticket price alone. Just the ability to play these games on a control pad to just feel so good and fitting. Just bear in mind that there are other favorites that I would love to play on here too that unfortunately don't work, including Shovel Knight. Either way, I think that there are enough supported ports on here to really say that this is a highlight for this device, because I had probably some of my most fun over the past month playing these games. Okay, so now we've taken the time to go over things like what I like about the hardware and about the software and everything else. So let's start wrapping up and talk about just what I think about this device overall right now. And I think there are a lot of things to love about the TrimUI Smart Pro, and there are a couple things that are worth warning about too. In the end, I thought that 3 different types of gaming is probably going to be where this device excels the most, and so let's talk about those 3 different use cases. The first is going to be those who want to do emulation but in a wider screen. For example, if you want to play Game Boy Advance at a close to native aspect ratio, or if you want to try out things like PlayStation 1, Dreamcast, or Nintendo 64 with widescreen hacks. In addition, if you want to play some light PSP games, this is going to be an excellent fit as well. Just bear in mind that for some of those higher end systems, not every game is going to play at full speed, and you will have to use some emulation hacks. However, if you're not into widescreen emulation, you just want to have a really nice 4x3 experience, I still do think there are better devices on the market for that one use case. I think any of the Anbernic RG-XX devices might be a better fit depending on the form factor you prefer. Another situation where I think the TrimUI Smart Pro might be a good fit is if you want a cheap streaming device, or if you want to be able to play widescreen PC ports via PortMaster. Like I mentioned, just playing some of these PC games on a small and beautiful handheld like this is almost worth it for me. However, I still also think that there are better PortMaster and streaming devices out there, including the Powkiddy X55. This one has a bigger screen, HDMI output, as well as a 5 GHz Wi-Fi. And then finally, I think that this still can be a very good device for all-around gaming, especially when playing 4x3 games, as long as you're okay with the black borders on the left and right. So when it comes down to it, I think that if you like the look of the TrimUI Smart Pro and you're willing to live with some of the quirks that we talked about throughout this video, then yes, I think it is well worth it for around $55. It's definitely got its flaws, and I wouldn't call it a perfect handheld, but for this price point, there are very few options that can compete with it, especially if you want something that's a little bit more widescreen friendly. Anyway, that's about it for this video. Let me know what you think of this updated review. Did you buy a TrimUI Smart Pro and are you enjoying it? Or are you playing something else or maybe in the market for this one too? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.